Yeah, they are teachers. I think we are ready to start. May I? Okay, we are about to start the second part of our conference. And our speaker will be Dr. Richard Deere from McGill University Libraries. He's a curator of manuscripts, rare books, and special collections. He's a head and curator. And he will talk about Norman Friedman Collector. Norman Friedman Collector from this collection. This is the collection of which include many of Arthur Szyk works.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. It's my great pleasure, in fact, to say a few words about the person who is responsible for the exhibition that you will be able to visit later this afternoon, that will be on in the foyer of the McLennan Library building till the end of January. And that's the Montrealer Norman Friedman. There are probably as many types of collectors as there are things to be collected. But nevertheless, some broad categories can be discerned. There are collectors who are totally consumed by their collections, sacrificing everything for their particular passion. There are others whose collecting is guided by their curiosity, and this can lead to eclectic collections on a variety of subjects, or multiple collections of a single genre. Author collections are a good example of the latter. Some collectors are famous, like Sir William Whistler here at McGill, but there are other collectors who leave little trace of themselves beyond their collections. These collectors are like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland, who vanishes from our view, leaving behind only the collections which they have brought together. Norman Friedman was a Cheshire Cat collector. He has left us his collections, but very little information about himself. What do we know then about Norman Friedman? Well, first that he was born in Montreal on the 28th of June in 1900, and that he graduated from McGill University with a BCS, a Bachelor of Commercial Studies degree, in 1921. We learn from the 1921 Old McGill yearbook that he went to Lower Canada College, that his favorite expression was woof woof, and that he was an associate editor of the McGill Daily in 1919 and 1920. He was also president of the Mandolin Club. We learned from other sources that he was a businessman and that he was a governor of the YMYWHA. He became active in the Boy Scout movement in 1928, serving in a number of leading positions, and received the Medal of Merit in 1942. He was a member of a number of organizations, including the American Philatelic Society, the Montreal Amateur Athletics Association, the Masons, and the Montefiore Club here in Montreal. We also know that he married Rose Matz in 1940 and died in 1981. But none of this tells us much about him as a collector or about his collections. For that, we must turn to the collections themselves and to one published interview. So what are the collections? As we shall see, Friedman's collecting was very wide-ranging, but what is of immediate concern to us are what can be called the book or literary collections, and these are all now held in rare books and special collections of the McGill University Library. Friedman collected the works of Rudyard Kipling. There are some 1,500 items here, including first editions and copies of magazines and newspapers in which Kipling's stories and verses first appeared. Kipling was Friedman's first love. This interest may have been sparked by Kipling's visit to Montreal in 1907. McGill awarded Kipling an honorary doctorate in 1899. Friedman also collected the works of the once popular and now largely forgotten American author, Christopher Morley. If he is remembered at all, it is for his novel, The Haunted Bookshop, first published in 1919. Much more relevant to McGill, however, is Friedman's collection of Stephen Leacock's works, whose student he had been. In addition to various editions of Leacock's books and some manuscripts and correspondence, there's the Joseph Karsh photographic portrait and the oil portrait of Leacock by the Montreal artist Fred Taylor, which hangs in the lobby of Rare Books and Special Collections. Friedman also collected the works of Robert Louis Stevenson and materials on the Boy Scouts. The latter collection is particularly rich, including a first edition in parts, that's how it first appeared, of Scouting for Boys in 1908, and some letters from Sir Robert and Lady Baden-Powell. Also of interest is the collection of some 70 drawings by the Montreal political cartoonist Arthur George Racy, who died in 1941. And this brings us to Arthur Szyk, or rather it does, but not quite yet. I mentioned earlier that in addition to the collections, there was one published interview with Norman Friedman, and it is to this that I want to direct our attention because it could tell us quite a good deal about the man. This anonymous interview appeared in the 15th of November 1938 issue of the Montrealer magazine. While I could be tempted to read the whole interview to you, I won't succumb to that temptation. Nevertheless, some extracts are well worth considering. The text of the interview, or rather, of the visit, begins as follows. When our telephone rang and Mr. Norman Friedman asked, would we care to drop in at his place, we said we would. We had heard of Mr. Friedman before. He lives at the Laurentian Apartments on Lower Côte-de-Neige Road, where he shares his quarters with his father, an amiable elderly gentleman with a trim Van Dyke beard, whom we found playing at Patience, an uncle, and a fox terrier named Mickey. At first meeting, Norman Friedman conveys the impression of the average, cultured, well-to-do businessman. Except that he is not average, the description is correct. For Mr. Friedman is vice president of the Allen people who make toffee and a partner in his father's wholesale clothing business, Friedman Brothers. Unlike most businessmen, Norman Friedman decided 15 years ago that it was silly when things went well and one's staff was capable to devote too much time to the routines of money-making. Since then, he has given only such time as he considers necessary in the useful interest of his office and devotes the rest to the hobby of collecting, which he loves with a passion. With a perseverance and thoroughness which do him honor, he has turned his apartment into a private museum. He differs from most amateur collectors in that he has not concentrated on one field to the exclusion of others, has chosen his curios, his scientific exhibits, literature with wisdom, and, as a result, has not cluttered up his place with a lot of junk. Nearly everything in the Friedman collection is of more than ordinary interest, and few of the objects, animals, unusual books are, to our knowledge, duplicated in Montreal, or for that matter, in Canada. Then the interview goes on to describe the various book collections. Taking up the text again, we read, from the library, we proceeded to the drawing room, which, apart from objects too manifold to describe, had a large table on which were set rows of glass bottles. Thus, what had once contained, according to the top, Heinz sweet pickles, now held a South American centipede, an unpleasant-looking fellow some 8 inches tall, the sting of which, our informant told us, would kill a man within 20 minutes. Fortunately, this one was preserved in alcohol. In a larger jar floated an oval, bulky object which was described as a baby sea cow. The monsters, when full grown, reach a size of up to 12 feet. A fine specimen of a Caribbean crucifix fish, creatures of the sea, innumerable butterflies, live fish in tanks, are only a few of the curios Mr. Friedman boasts in his collection. A glass case contains a complete exhibit of opium, from the poppy to the pipe, Mr. Friedman had to obtain special permission from the RCMP to keep this. And I might just add, this particular part of his collection is spelled at McGill. Not pretty, but interesting is the exhibit of biological embryos. And then the article goes on to describe stamps and coin collections, merely a sideline, and sword guns. But it was getting late. We accepted our host's offer of a nightcap, then took our leave. In parting, we inquired as to what was his object in inviting us to write up his collection. He shrugged his shoulders. If it is interesting to me, it might be to others. Why should I be selfish about it? And now finally to Arthur Szyk. Unfortunately, we don't know how Norman Friedman came to be interested in Szyk, but clearly he did so, and his collection of the artist's works was largely complete when it was when it was exhibited, I think for the second time, in fact, at the Redpath Library at McGill University in the fall of 1954. What we do know is where he acquired at least some of the items in his collection, and more or less when he began. The earliest correspondence in the files suggests that it was in 1950 that Friedman seriously began to collect Szyk materials. He dealt with the Szyk bookshop and Philip Duchesne in New York, and the well-known stamp dealer Casimir Bileski in Winnipeg. There may have been others, but there is no trace of them. It was Bileski, for example, who was responsible for commissioning from Szyk the United Nations series. There are various issues of popular magazines in the collection. Look, Collier's, Esquire, Life, Fortune, and Coronet may have been acquired by Friedman at the time of publication. Finally, we know that he brought together an unusually rich collection of materials by which Arthur Szyk, we can get a comprehensive view of his work, of this unusual and fascinating Polish-American Jewish illustrator. But beyond this, there is very little. And Norman Friedman disappears from our view, leaving behind only his collection, and in particular, his Arthur Szyk collection. A Cheshire Cat collector indeed. Thank you.
Could we put my program on, please? So, my name is Irvin Ungar, and I'm from Burlingame, California, just outside of San Francisco. So I have made the trip from San Francisco to Montreal for my 20 minutes of fame. Well, I don't know if it would be fame. My role is twofold. I wear two hats. Just to let you know a little bit about me, I'm in the inquiry and book world, so I buy and sell rare books for a living, and the art world. That's how I put chicken on the table on Friday nights. And also, I serve as the curator of the Arthur Szyk Society. It's a non-profit located in Burlingame, California, whose purpose is to bring about a renaissance of interest in Arthur Szyk's art and to transmit his art and messages to the world. And so I've been really interested in Szyk's art for almost 2 decades, and been really involved in trying to spread the word through lectures and writing and publishing and helping to curate museum exhibitions. And now there is a pointer that I can use. Is this it over here?
The pointer doesn't work on the screen.
Okay, but this advances the pictures.
Advances.
Okay, well, we'll see if it works right. So let me say at the outset that Arthur Szyk loved 3 countries during his lifetime. He loved Poland, which was the land of his birth. Szyk did not care for any anti-Semitism that he experienced, but he loved Poland. He loved the land of Israel, which he saw as the land of his people. And he loved America, which he saw as the land of his ideals. Now, Szyk lived in all of these countries. He lived in the land of Israel only for a period, visited for a period of 6 months in 1914. But he lived extensively in Poland and, of course, America. But he also lived for a decade in France, And he also lived for at least 3 years in London. And the shortest stay in any country where he lived was in Canada. And so my presentation to you is very focused. It's on Arthur Szyk in Canada. This is a small little vignette from a larger piece, and which I hope to advance here. There we are. And this work is dedicated by Szyk to, with love for man and nature. And what Szyk goes on to say here in 1940, when he painted this, was that he hopes that what happened to the sons and to the children of Poland, of his homeland, will not happen to the sons and daughters and the children of the people of Canada. And this work of art was painted by him in Ottawa in 1940. And it was during Szyk's stay here in Canada, which really was for a period of 3 months, that he created a whole series of works, and in fact was intended for him to paint an entire history of Canada of over 50 works of art. Unfortunately, only a few of them were completed before that series ended. It may have been because he then went on to the United States. But this would have been one of those works in the series where you see in the bottom right-hand corner here a Szyk self-portrait holding his easel, surrounded by all the wonderful elements of the Canadian people and its landscape. When an exhibition of Szyk was held in Ottawa, the Consul General of Poland, who was living in Ottawa, but an exhibition that was then held in Toronto, he went to Toronto for this exhibition. This is what the Consul General said, who was a friend of Arthur Szyk's, by the way. His name was Victor Podolsky, and he said the following: "When studying the beauty and the greatness of Arthur Szyk, you will have sight of the inner world of the artist. You will learn of his amazing knowledge of the history of nations, of races, and of personalities, of his meticulous thoroughness, of his originality, of his psychology, of his unusual memory, of his profound knowledge of human nature, and last but not least, of the spirit which has animated his works." Arthur Szyk came to Canada in July of 1940, and already newspapers were talking about Szyk coming to America to spread insight into his people's culture. His people at this time would have been twofold. His people would have been the Polish people and Poland and the Jewish people. Szyk was living in London from 1937 to 1940. And it was the Polish government in exile, the Polish government that had moved to London, and the British government that helped support the bringing of Arthur Szyk further west to help bring the face of the war in Europe to this part of the Western world. And so here you have a newspaper clipping from Szyk's own scrapbook. The writing at the top, the Montreal Star, July 2nd of 40, is Szyk's handwriting. He kept meticulous scrapbooks of all of the articles that appeared about him. And even if Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a column about Arthur Szyk, and she wrote several columns about Szyk, he had every clipping of Eleanor Roosevelt in all the 50 or 60 newspapers that same clipping appeared in the United States. He kept every one of them, and he annotated all of them. When Szyk arrived here in Canada, here in the Halifax Herald, the title was that famed Polish artist has a price on his head. So popular was his art in Europe and in England, his anti-Nazi art, that newspapers began to write about him, that there was a price on his head. Whether there was or not, we don't know. And even the German government and researchers have been looking for materials. I've been working with them. We haven't found specifically Szyk named, but the idea was that his art was so well known and so well distributed that people were well aware of it, and they were writing articles such as this, where he came to America he came to Canada and then went on to the United States. But his daughter, Alexandra, who is now 90 years old and that Alexander referred to, remembers that Szyk came on this convoy over across the ocean that was carrying rich treasures of the Polish government in these other ships when they came across the Atlantic. Here is a certificate that Szyk was asked to fill out. It's the national registration for the Dominion of Canada. And what I want to point out to you is that here he was asked what his present occupation. This is in August of 1940. He's here for about a little more than a month, 5 weeks. He fills this out, and when he's asked what his present occupation is, he says it's an artist. And then it asks, what is your regular occupation? It's an artist. What other kind of work do you do? And Szyk wrote the word fight. For he saw himself as a fighting artist. The phrase was used before that Arthur Szyk saw himself as a soldier in art. And in fact, in one painting, which is of Franklin Roosevelt, that Szyk presented to Eleanor Roosevelt, Arthur Szyk signed his name, FDR's Soldier in Art. And that's how he saw himself. And the next question is asked here. If you are experienced in any skilled industrial occupation, can you describe specifically what the type or types of work are in which you are engaged? And he said war, propaganda, cartoons. He wanted to be of service to the Canadian government because he saw himself as a man who was at the service of humanity, and that he was going to use his pen sort of as his sword and its brush as its ally in his fight against terror. And of course he cites down here that he did fight as a soldier, in the guerrilla unit in warfare in the Imperial Russian and Polish armies, and in fact Arthur Szyk did. And he gave up his service in the Russian army for which he was conscripted. Happily he fled and went back to Łódź, his hometown. That's how he survived. But after the war was over, World War I, and Poland went to war with the Soviet Union, Szyk was in the army, but then left and was appointed the director of art propaganda for Poland in its war against the Soviet Union. So from the very beginning, 1919, 1920, he was already creating art on behalf of the war effort. I might say that several years before that, while a student in Paris, Szyk was creating all kinds of caricatures that were pointing out the ills of society and the social injustices that he saw. And while a student in Paris as a 15 and 16-year-old, he was sending those drawings back to Łódź, where they were being published in many newspapers and in magazines. So he was always politically active. So you have an activist artist who really is trying to reach the largest number of people through his art. Then all of his art was created for reproduction and for mass distribution. That was the way that Szyk saw himself as most effective on behalf of the peoples that he loved. And when he arrived here in Canada, newspapers began to pick up on Szyk's mission here as soon as he landed. Here you see, art must be mobilized, declares the great Polish painter. And this appeared in the Ottawa Journal in July of 1930, July of 31st, 1940. And here I'm showing you work specific to being created in Canada. The work here is self-evident. Here you have the Canadian Mountie who's going to punch this Nazi soldier. Just a minute, you hold on, I'm going to take care of you. And here you have, I must tell you, these works are watercolor and gouache paintings, and they're only about this size. This is the average size of Szyk's work. Always works on paper, never oiled, never on canvases. In fact, you have the pleasure of being in the presence of one Szyk original that's in this room right now. You must see the original work of art that was brought here, not by me, but one of your participants for exhibition. And in the lovely exhibition that's held in the library across the street, you're going to see some other Szyk originals, some pencil drawings and ink drawings and some other watercolors as well. Again, another article here. The Citizen claims fighting art to be a powerful weapon of war, and this appeared in the Citizen in Ottawa. Another work of art, let's go after his scalp, redcoat. And Szyk loved to infuse humor in his art. Oftentimes people ask me if when you're teaching his art to young people, because he created such inhuman pieces of the Japanese during World War II. Szyk hated the Japanese in a way very different from which he hated the Germans and the Nazis for what they were doing. But Szyk saw the Japanese as really the Nazis of the East, and he makes them look so like baboons and like animals. And it's propaganda art. But the Japanese were racist. You know, almost 25 million Chinese died as a result of the Japanese aggression and racism. And Szyk is pointing that out in his art. So when I talk to young people today and they ask me about, well, isn't Szyk's art a little bit this? And I have to point to them, it's within the context. You need to understand what a propaganda artist was doing. Of course, you should also know at the same time, and I'm using the prerogative of being able to sort of say whatever I want, you should know that Szyk was a great advocate for the rights of the African American and the black man in America, and created civil rights art in the 1940s, well before the civil rights movement. In fact, just as an aside, in 1943 he was interviewed in a newspaper in which he was asked if you didn't have to create art on behalf of the rescue of European Jews and on behalf of the Allies, what would you be doing? And in 1943, Szyk said, I would devote my life to the enfranchisement or the freedom of the black man in America. An immigrant, only 3 years, a Polish Jew who's really interested in African American rights and the rights of minorities. So here you see that, and I have this clipping from here that I showed earlier, claims fighting art to be a powerful weapon of war. It makes reference to works that Szyk created, one of them being of St. George slaying the dragon, which was purchased by Queen Mary in England, and Szyk hoped that this was giving permission to the Polish government to use this image, which then appeared in the newspaper, to produce on poster stamps, you know, like Easter seals on poster stamps, and Szyk created an awful lot of them that were distributed. At the same time, this article that I showed earlier, here in 1940, talks about that Arthur Szyk had created a whole series of paintings dealing with George Washington and the American Revolution. And in fact, at the time that this article was written in the newspaper in 1940, this painting and 37 others on freedom by Arthur Szyk were hanging in the White House, in Franklin Roosevelt's White House. So I like to often ask people, you know, do you know whose art was hanging in the White House when Roosevelt gave his For Freedom speech in January of 1941? That's right, 38 paintings of the Polish Jewish artist Arthur Szyk that had been purchased by the President of Poland, Mościcki, in 1935 and given to Franklin Roosevelt as a gift to create closer relations between Poland and the United States. And that's how Szyk's art was used. And of course, this article was capturing the essence of that, as well as this article refers to a series of paintings, of 23 paintings, that Arthur Szyk had created called the Polish-American Fraternity series, where again, Szyk painted Polish heroes who contributed to the well-being of America, and these were exhibited at the Polish Pavilion in 1939 at the World's Fair when the war broke out. Szyk loved his heroes, and in this instance, he chose to emphasize their contribution to America. Here are the pioneers of Jamestown. But there were others, of Pulaski and Kosciuszko and so on and so on. And 1 year later, after the invasion of Poland in September of '39, in September of 1940, Arthur Szyk was reminding the people of Canada and the world that Poland is still our ally, hence this work of art. And the idea that there were press releases constantly being done here in Canada while Szyk was here. This was a statement by Winston Churchill, which was quoted earlier by my colleague and friend Alexander, where it talks about that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And of course it goes on to talk about Arthur Szyk, and there you see the image that was released with it, Keepers of the Moat, where if I'm not mistaken you have over here the Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force side by side. I'm correct, right?
Yes.
Okay. Good, I thought so. All right. So in any case, it's the first time I'm showing this image publicly, so I had to make sure I got it right. But this work, again, was drawn by Szyk while he was here in Canada. Again, the Canadian drive for fighting art urged Szyk wanted other artists to pick up the banner and to call. In fact, in 1934, the year after Hitler was in power, Szyk was saying in an interview, actually had come to America in 1934 for 7 months because he was being honored by the American government. And he said in an interview that a Jewish artist cannot remain neutral in these times. And he thought that abstraction of a kind of art was not possible, should not be done, and he had to take up the art as a fighting artist. And so they went back to Poland in 1934, and eventually came back to America, Canada first in 1940. We're coming to America. And again, other articles that were appearing in Fortress of Our Hopes, Poles term for England. And this appeared in the Globe and Mail. I didn't know much about the Globe and Mail, but I picked up a copy at my hotel, so I now know it's still in business. And the Evening Telegraph was also showing that a brilliant Polish artist who creates cartoons in wartime. And so this exhibition was held at the Meliors-Lang Galleries in Toronto, at which Victor Podolsky, whom I mentioned earlier and whom I quoted, gave the opening address. He loved Szyk, and it just, I've read that speech so many times, and every time I read it, I almost cry, because it's just like filled with so much love that he had, and so much admiration for Arthur Szyk. By the way, I had a chance on Sunday to visit the Holocaust Museum here, and I was reading some of the panels there. And do you know how many Jews between 1933 and 1938 were admitted to Canada? Anyhow, I learned there was about 4,200. And between 1939 and the end of the war, there were only about another 4,000 that were admitted. Only about 8,000 Jews. Canada did not want immigrants. Look, the United States didn't want immigrants either, and Roosevelt turned away the St. Louis and many others. But people were afraid to bring immigrants, and so for a Pole and for a Jew to make it over here was a double sort of jeopardy in a way, because they feared, many times there's quotes, even your Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, made a statement that the immigrants are much more dangerous than Hitler himself. And so that was the presence you had here. But there was a feeling you had in America, too, in its attitude towards minorities, and particularly to Jews, and the attitudes of isolationism that faced the American government, that Szyk attacked violently, and he hated that. He really felt that free nations of the world had to be involved in the affairs of man. It wasn't a matter of one's own people, it was a matter of liberty and freedom of all people. And if I could say something about what drives me about Arthur Szyk, if you get a sense that I'm driven by Arthur Szyk, you're right. But what drives me about Szyk is that here was a man who stood up against oppression and tyranny for freedom and justice, who loved his people so much. And that people that I'm referring to in this instance is the Jewish people, in that he took the value system of fighting against oppression and he used it to be an advocate for humanity at large, which meant that during the war years, Szyk raised money for the Poles during his exhibitions in New York, for the Chinese, for the Czechs, for the Australian soldiers, for the New Zealand soldiers, for the soldiers from New Zealand. And I have all the letters that were written to him from all these countries, from the Paderewski Fund that money was sent, and the Bundles for Britain, and all these organizations, which is to say, what Szyk, I believe, was saying is, care about who you are and who your people are, and use the best of that tradition to help make the world a better place. I think that's what was driving Szyk. I think that's what his art was about. He used to say, art is not my aim, it's my means. And again, the Statute of Kalisz, which you've seen earlier, there were two parts to this. One part was in the 13th century by Boleslav the Pious to show the civil and religious privileges that were given to the Jews of Poland, to the minorities, but particularly to the Jews, and reaffirmed by subsequent Polish kings. And the second part of the Statutes of Kalisz was to show the mutual and beneficial relationship that existed between Poles and Jews, and the contributions that Jews made to Polish society. That Poland is a history not only of the Holocaust, but of centuries and centuries of kinship and friendship. Szyk created this artwork in the 1920s because he felt that civil privileges, rights, were being threatened by Poland and the world, and by particularly what was going on in Europe. And when he completed this portfolio, when it was printed for the first time, as mentioned 80 years ago in 1932, the Polish government then traveled that portfolio, that body of work, to 14 cities throughout Poland. They took this Jew's work, Polish Jewish work, and used it as a way of creating and showing what Poles hoped to accomplish for its people, and using Szyk's work because Szyk was interested in the defense of his people at that time. And again, while Szyk was still here in Canada, the painter and the clipper. Obviously, Hitler was a failed painter, but here Szyk is worried about the success of this painter as he paints the world with his racist ideology. And again, also created in Ottawa, the pig, the Nazi swine, who's lying over Paris in 1940, and in 1940 in June, Paris falls. The idea that one needs to, whatever Air Force one is, to take up arms against this threat. Szyk, famed Polish artist, states that the German is a weasel. He had no problem hating the Germans. He hated German militarism, Bismarck, Kaiser Wilhelm, right on through. And it's a testament, I think, well, you know, how Germany has embarked for years now on this concept of Vergangenheit Bewältigung, the idea of Germany coming to terms with its past. Well, in 2008, a major exhibition of Arthur Szyk's art was held in Berlin, and that was the thing that the Germans appreciated about Szyk, is that while they were so caught up in their own propaganda, they were fascinated by that here was a free man in the West who was creating propaganda of truth against their own people. And so exhibitions were held here in Canada. After the exhibition at the Melior's Lang Gallery, it went on to a press club later that month, on September 30th. And then in October, Szyk comes to America. He's here only 3 months. But again, newspaper articles there referring to Szyk, for whom Hitler offers a reward to show works at the YMHA tomorrow. So that whole idea that, let's just say, mythology surrounding Szyk, but not mythology when it comes to the fact that his art was well known in both Germany and in Japan. And I might add, it was so well known in Japan that the Japanese reproduced one of Szyk's works of art, of showing the Japanese as terrorists, really, and using contemporary terms, but as terror. They reproduced it, the Japanese, and they dropped it from their planes on American soldiers. So, and his work was being known. And I should also tell you how well it was known in America. Do you know, Arthur Szyk's art was, while Norman Rockwell was creating all the covers for the Saturday Evening Post, Szyk was creating all the covers for Collier's magazine. Do you know what the circulation was of the Saturday Evening Post? 3 million, and 2.5 million copies of the Collier's magazine were being distributed. His art was being seen everywhere, and in fact, his work was shown at over 500 USO bases. Every GI, every soldier who went overseas saw Arthur Szyk's art, and an Esquire magazine survey said that his art was more popular with the GIs, with the soldiers under the Selective Service Act, than were pinups. And I've met young men who, well, now they're older, whose fathers had flak jackets, and he took me, he brought one, he showed me, I was at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, he brought the jacket, and out of the jacket he took a cartoon that his father carried in the jacket, and it was a caricature of Szyk that he had. So. But these works were also created in 1940. It appeared when Szyk was in America. This is a madman's dream. Szyk is showing Hitler sitting on the throne with his cronies by his side, the Japanese and the militarists. Uncle Sam and John Bull, the Americans and the British, are in chains, while Hitler's, at his feet, is the globe of the world, and the Untermensch, the Jew, is the rug that's at Hitler's feet. This is painted in 1940, before America was, and Canada were in, well, Canada was in the war, America was not at this time. And here, while he was in Canada, he visited General Motors plant and created this work of art that was printed here in a Canadian newspaper. Work for Victory, Lend to Win, and here's how industry is contributing to the fight. And Szyk did a lot of this commercial art in the United States for U.S. Steel and Coca-Cola, and endless for Casualty Company, for car companies, and so on. And he created this whole series of paintings that were commissioned by the Canadian stamp entrepreneur Casimir Bolesky from Winnipeg. 9 countries in which he wanted to create a visual history, summarize all the great elements of these countries, and then put them within a single page. Of course, rather than emphasize China or Soviet Union, or I chose Canada for you today. And here you see many of the elements of Canada. And here you have Arthur Szyk, 1894 to 1951. After devoted a lifetime to fighting against injustice and for liberty and for freedom, Szyk died a young man in America. It turns out that in 1949, he was listed as a member of numerous subversive organizations by the United States government, by the House on Un-American Activities. It contributed, Szyk had a series of heart attacks, and in 1950, I should add, he created his greatest Americana, the Declaration of Independence of the United States. It's his largest work. The original now hangs at the Library of Congress. And the Bill of Rights and Four Freedoms Prayer. Szyk loved America. He loved freedom. But this was one of the 2 great tragedies in his life. The other being when his mother and brother were taken from the Łódź ghetto and killed in Chełmno. And then at this point in his life, when you can imagine a person whose works are in the White House, who was celebrated by the president and by Eleanor Roosevelt, and then at the end of his life, this took place. So this is Arthur Szyk's life, and here he's been remembered in Canada on numerous occasions. In 1954, there was another exhibition. 1950, there was an exhibit, even after he had been in America. Here's an exhibit in 1954. And then what I say is that thank you so much for Stanislav, for Stefan, and everyone who's organized this exhibition to help return Arthur Szyk to another country they love, the Dominion of Canada. So thank you very much. I only have a postscript to this. This is that since I'm not quite sure that any papers will be published as a result of this symposium, because it's a small one. It's been organized so wonderfully in such a short time by Stanislav and Stefan. What I do want to point out to you is that you can continue. What I would love to see happen is that every person here tell at least 2 other people about Arthur Szyk. And then also, another thing you can do is go to the website of Szyk. You now know how to spell Szyk, to szyk.org, which is the website of the Arthur Szyk Society. And there you'll see 10 different slideshows of over 300 images of Arthur Szyk's art in all the subject areas. And tomorrow my staff has the orders to actually take this presentation and put it on the internet. So we're going to add, next to Arthur Szyk and Israel, Arthur Szyk in America, Arthur Szyk in Poland, we're adding Arthur Szyk in Canada. But we wanted to wait, Stan, until after the presentation today to put it on the website. Also, I'd like to call your attention to the fact that there are numerous publications about Arthur Szyk. When I first got involved in 15, 20 years ago, there were no books anywhere about Arthur Szyk. You couldn't read about him anywhere. Yes, there was one book in 1980 that was published in Yiddish in Israel. It got no circulation really in the world. So now there's been more than a dozen books, 7 documentaries, numerous exhibitions, a re-emergence of Arthur Szyk in Poland, thanks really to Professor Alexander Skotnicki, a colleague of his, Joanna Podolska. But what is really being done is that, see, Arthur Szyk is being claimed by different peoples. This is the best thing that could happen. Szyk would love this. Szyk would love to be claimed as a Pole, as a Jew, as an American, as a citizen soldier of the free world. And I think that's the great tribute to Szyk and the people who are attracted to him. And now, I warn you, be careful. If you study too much art of Arthur Szyk, you're going to get hooked. So go to Szyk.com, and there's some books back there.